Hi everybody, it's Sam. So today I'm going to do something special. I really like this book called The Shape of Water by Ann Spollin. It's about a teenage girl who just has a very different view on things and is dealing with the death of her mother and a lot of other different family stuff, but she just has a really interesting take on it. The author is just very good and lyrical and I'll read the summary to you. The summary says, just a moment. Oh, hold on. Here we go. I had come to know silence well during those months after my mother died. When you sit in silence long enough, you learn that silence has emotion. It glides over you without shape or form, but with weight, exactly like water. Magdala's mother always said that the world was full of strange and beautiful secrets only the two of them could see. But now she's gone, and Magdala's world is flooded with anxiety and loneliness, and maybe madness. As an imaginary family of bickering fish begins to torment her, Magdala's only outlet is starting beautiful but destructive fires in the marshes near her house. The Shape of Water is a darkly lyrical and surprising tapestry of the mundane and the surreal, in which Magda begins to untangle her family's secrets and search for a stable place in the world. So, that's the thing. And now, chapter 1. Okay, chapter 1. I discovered windows one afternoon, and after that, nothing was ever the same. They had always been there, of course, glass panes shimmering in the color of rain, but that spring, for the first time, I was able to open the windows in my room. The locks had been painted shut for years, but during that winter, the heat from the radiator finally steamed enough paint off the metal wings, and the locks could be twirled open. Knowing that I could open the windows attracted me to them, and I began sitting under them, staring through the glass at the sky. From that position on a chair in my room, the sky did not seem real. It seemed a place I was making up, so I watched it. The white wood of the window panes acted as frames, so the sky came to me slowly, and the huge openness of its space did not touch me. All the window glass in our old house had waves and bubbles inside it, so at times the clouds moved by like water, melting and blurring until they passed outside of the warp. But after a few afternoons of sitting, the heavens seemed too quiet to keep watching, so instead I began watching a small patch of woods nearby our yard that housed little more than trees and a scatter of bony, mean-looking rabbits. I started gazing at the sky in the woods in March, when the branches were still wet, and it was then, with nothing outside my windows but trees and rain, that I noticed. I started gazing at the sky and the woods in March, when the branches were still wet, and it was then, with nothing outside my windows but trees and rain, that I noticed a sheen inside darkness, colors glimmering within the darkness of the wood. I watched birds come and go, and I watched rain nipple down from buds to the grass. The water dripping from the branch edges and leaves created noticeable tricks. I could see that as I watched leaves melt. Then one day I ventured into the space outside. I did not think about doing this much beforehand. I simply opened a window and dropped to the ground below, uncertain as to why this should be so much more satisfying. I dropped to the ground below, uncertain as to why this should be a so much more satisfying exit than simply using the door. My father worked until 7 o'clock, and I could do whatever I wanted until then, but I liked the solid sound my legs made when I landed. Leaving via a 5-foot drop seemed so much more a decision than just using a door. The sense of escape made my heart pound, though all I escaped was the sound spread of moss-colored light inside my house, and the silence. I had come to know silence well during those months after my mother died. When you sit in silence long enough, you learn that silence has emotion. It glides over you without shape or form, but with weight, exactly like water. Its color is silver, and silence has a sound you hear only after hours of waiting inside it. The sound is soft, like flute notes rising up, like the words of glass speaking. Then there comes a point when you must shatter that silence, when you must shatter the blindness of its words, the blindness of its light. I did this by going into the yard. Once I stood there in the grass next to the trees I had been watching. I found silence outside as well, but I was happier outside than I had been in the house, so I stayed for a bit. I stood beneath my bedroom windows for a few minutes, looking up at the branches and the crooked pieces of sky colliding between the branches. I believed I could identify the scent of the sky as I stood there, a blue menthol fragrance similar to the scent of seawater that sprayed into my face when I first dove into the ocean. That initial scent was more subtle than the ocean's heavy, fishy aroma. It was a whiff of salt and mint just as I approached the water on a dive that warned that a more powerful scent would soon enter my nose. It was the scent I dreamed in, and it was the scent of that spring sky as I stood in the yard. I repeated this act of leaving through the window each day until the middle of April, when I decided to leave the yard as well. I had never been drawn to the outdoors in the way that some people are, always gardening or jaunting off to the beach or the park. The first time I ventured outside, I stood in the yard for a few minutes listening to the silence concuss. The silence outdoors differed from the silence inside the house. Here I stood inside a cavity with no borders, with no limits, a place as terrifying and infinite as the ocean, as space. At least inside the house I could believe the silence ended, that it was finite, that once I stepped out of the house I would find the rest of life continuing. The silence outdoors stunned, and the first few times I stood in the yard I could not move. So I had to will myself to leave the yard, a task that some days I could not carry out, and on those days when I could not leave, I retreated back inside the house, the sharp taste of failure filling my mouth. When I finally left the yard, boredom helped me grow bolder. Each day I walked further until I began walking through the woods adjacent blocks. Our neighborhood spread about a mile up from the Raritan Bay through a simmer of marshes to dry woodland. Nothing was balanced about this section of Staten Island. Houses in our neighborhood were separated by large thatches of woods, or they were so close together that someone doing dishes in one house could glance from the sink to see the family next door doing their dishes. Bungalows abutted glassy modern homes. Duplexes shadowed the backyards of older homes. In this jumble of buildings and residences, a bait shop might be directly next door to a family house. A family house might have a side yard where cars were painted or boat engines were stored. At the top of our street ran a 4-lane boulevard, a sash separating where we lived in the older, beachier part from the newer houses. If our neighborhood lacked symmetry, this neighborhood defined it. All the houses above the boulevard were new and resembled one another, candies in a box. They each had the same size yard, the same number of windows, the same placement of doors and driveways, as if the streets served as a board game and the houses were the playing pieces. The windows were positioned on either side of the door so that each house had the appearance of a face looking out over a long rectangular nose. The only trees were short shrubs planted by the owners, all in the same spots so that the shrubs resembled nothing more than a green collar framing the glassy faces of the houses. Near us, vines of tree branches twisted vacant bungalows uninhibited for years, liked emitting the same haunted damp as caves. Marshes harbored milky plants that grew pods, and sharp-beaked Halloween birds gaggled about. Watching our streets' surfaces change without warning from asphalt to woods to sand. Up there in the miles of new housing, the streets stretched predictably in the way I imagined the days lived inside them to stretch, shaped by routine, each day dissolving perfectly into the next. On one of these streets lived my closest friend Julie, a Halon. I thought of her house each time I looked to the boulevard, the way her mother had planted circles of flowers around each sapling, the way she had placed frothy curtains in each window, so each window appeared iced and festive as a cake. Life proceeded differently inside these houses, that much I knew. Those houses existed in the same safe pocket I slipped inside each time I went to school or watched television, a pocket stitched in such a way that dream and error could not enter. I had been allowed enough glimpses into that pocket where those lives were kept that I had begun to recognize the smooth contours of their fabric. On Julie's last birthday, we went ice skating with our mother and two of Julie's cousins. My mother skimmed the ice with the fluid grace of falling snow. When she saw Julia clutching the edge of the rink, my mother took her hand. "It's really no different from swimming, Julia. You just have to lose your land legs and open to the ice." Julia shook her head. "I can't. I'll fall." Mrs. Hallen had looked on, her mouth tightening with the realization that her surprise party might be failing. If you predict you fall, then you probably will. Let's predict that you'll make it to the circle over there." My mother pointed to a circle about 10 yards from where she stood with Julia. "I'm telling you, Julia, it really is like swimming. You just have to give a few things up. And the first one is your assurance of gravity." "Give up gravity," Julia repeated, a little stunned by my mother's phrasing. But she took my mother's hand and managed to skate to the circle. Mrs. Hallen's face brightened, and her admiration of my mother was as obvious as the lighting of a neon sign. The party went on, the birthday was celebrated, plans proceeded according to Mrs. Hallen's schedule. Back at Julia's house, for the cake and ice cream, her mother turned to me. "Maggie, your mom really saved the day. I'm not sure what would have happened if she hadn't been there. I guess I thought Julia was more athletic than she is." I nodded and murmured something vague and gauzy to match the party mood. I wanted to tell Mrs. Hallen that nothing would have happened, at least if it had been me who had feared the ice. My mother would not have held the party. She would have changed plans entirely and taken me to a movie instead, or out to watch birds land on a pond. We lived a life that moved more with the plans and motions of water. Julia's life had walls and dams, places of prediction and intent. Julia's life, unlike mine, would never collapse. I thought this while looking outside at the solid roofs of the houses surrounding her house, at the endless rows of fencing. Our neighborhood had no such geography, and at times the whole area did not seem real, with ocean fog and smoke from beach fires left to smolder. People coming out to retrieve the morning paper and relieve their dogs could look like ghosts in the haze, and their bodies moved in an edgeless way, so that if I looked too quickly, I believed spirits had come up from the beach, drowning victims or lost sea captains, come to reclaim what they had not finished during their time on Earth. Then I realized it was only the old, retired tugboat captains who hollered nonsense out their windows, or the always drunk lady out to check the mail that had piled in her box for days. I could not imagine these people or their acts occurring in Julia's neighborhood or anywhere above the boulevard. We lived in one of life's basins, a place where whatever or whoever could seek refuge. I asked my mother about our neighborhood once, why it was so open, so irregular. She explained that we lived closer to the wind, to the water, where ancient dreams still spirited the air. My mother wanted me to like where we lived, to like the the surus of the sea, and the way wind rose from the ocean year-round to like our house, which was dark and old and sprouted lozenges of mold under the eaves. Because she had wanted me to do this, I said I did. But even back then, before my mother began having headaches that blackened her vision with their force, I thought of the homes above the boulevard, over us, as permanent, as a place where no raw examples of life or death lay on the surface as they did on our beach. Up there, the only moving life, other than human, was an occasional well-mannered dog or a yard cat. On our beach, my mother and I found starfish adhering to logs. We watched crabs scurry back to the water. We found eels and fish inside logs and barrels. Many of them were dead, their flesh and veins open to the salt air, or the birds who picked at their stilled forms. Swimmers walked past the bodies, or swam and floated around the ones that were washing ashore, as if the water served as a margin between life and death, a place where boundaries vanished. The houses above us were quietly contained places, and as I began school and met children mostly from the new houses, I separated the two places in my mind. I gave them names. The houses above us were the Standard, and where we lived was the Drift, a place that changed, a place more prone to oddities and the random shaping forces of wind, of water, a place of motion. The Standard had stillness. I told my mother what I thought of the two places, and she said, "But who would want to live in stillness? Here we have treasures, surprises." I knew what she meant, and because I did, we lived apart from most other people, or we did until she died. Then I was alone. I feared the Standard, feared that I had lived too long in the Drift to ever leave its silent strangeness. I feared that the Drift had formed me, and wherever I went, its influence would be evident, setting me apart as people noticed a certain peculiarity to my thoughts, to my behaviors. And I could not stay in the Drift much longer. It was too lonesome and far too terrifying a place to inhabit alone. My mind was growing in strange directions inside all the silence. I tried to explain some of this to Julia one day during gym. "You are so weird," she had laughed, as I whispered to her about how ever since my mother died, I saw creatures and heard sounds that I never knew existed before. "You probably just need to get more sleep, or stop reading so much. Maggie, all that reading is making you think this way." I laughed with her, but her response warned me that I could not approach her again. Not only did I lack the knowledge of how to exist in the Standard world, I lacked the tools to obtain that knowledge as well. Julia would have phrased her awareness in a way that would have been interesting. I could imagine being curious about her newfound abilities. I spoke more in the freighted tone of public confession, and I certainly could not tell her about the fish that had begun swimming in and out of my thoughts, their scales glittering like patches of sun in a cloudy sky. I had to get better control of my mind. My thoughts existed much like the chaos below the ocean's surface, seemingly quiet, while an entire universe scurried about beneath shining glosses of water. It was the same with my brain, with my mind, with the oddness of thoughts that were only all right with my mother or alone at the beach. To see me at school, behaving and acting normally, nodding and walking like everyone around me, was to see my shining gloss. The rest of me, most of me, was hidden like the secret undertow, and I could no longer remain inside the undertow. I was alone there, with silence and memory and gazing. Each of these activities had begun speaking to me in the slow, weighted vocabulary of loss. I would have to think of a way to leave. Leaving my room was a beginning. Once my feet had landed so solidly on the ground outside, I knew I could never return to sitting by the windows, to the solitude of that place that moved like a dream unfolding backwards. I would have to leave the silence that waited to swallow me in a waterless drowning. The idea of the buses came to me one day as I looked up to the boulevard while standing on the sidewalk by my house. I could not see the buses stuttering along, boxy vehicles, slow and lumbering as elephants, yet they offered containment within the vastness of the outdoors. To reach the nearest bus stop, I had to wait in front of a strip of stores that were as random as the contents of a tide. A pet store stood apart from a bakery that led to a tavern. A shoe repair shop shared a roof with both a deli and a notions store. I never saw people inside any of these places, and the whole mess seemed ghostly. The junk shop especially terrified me. It looked entirely constructed of dust, with its sepia-toned windows held items that had no reason to be together. Vacuum bags shouldered typewriters, typewriter ribbons, and dolls. Spools of thread tumbled around drill bits. Tins of candy tottered in one corner. Under the eaves of the notion store, a string of Christmas lights had rusted into place. The wires dipped just below the overhang, and the few remaining bulbs had all broken, resulting in a jagged hobo's grin. I cannot imagine whoever stopped in such a place. While waiting for the bus, I brought a book with me to avoid glancing at the stores. It was while standing there, in the middle of the day, right on the boulevard, with cars and trucks and bicyclists whirring around me, and the ghostly notion shop behind me, in the middle of that day, where everything was running as normal as water, that thoughts of fires would not leave my mind. I did not want to think of fire, to think of the girl who had set the fire. I cannot get my mind to obey. I wondered if the junk shop pressed the memory of fire on me, pressed on me with the weight of two hands resting on my shoulders. The building's air of defeat, of failure, and disuse would stir dark thoughts in anyone. I pushed the image of fire from my mind. I stared into the book. I knew my mother would walk away to the next bus stop. She believed places influenced us. She believed in spirits and premonitions, in the ability of wind to prompt vivid dreams, even fevers. I refused these beliefs just as I stood in front of the store, my face steady in front of the open book. The words I read began to whisper. Did you just walk through the woods on those days? Maybe you heard the hissing of the fields and the trees. Maybe you sat down in a hidden spot. You start with a ring of stone. You make a circle, like the commencement of a witch's ritual. A circle of stone. Nothing can be in the shape of a wing. In a circle of stone, nothing can be in the shape of a wing. You collect sticks from the floor of the woods, dry, small pieces, not much bigger than straw, but dry. That is the most important, dryness. Then you place these pieces tenderly inside the stone, the permanent with the fragile. One match. While the straw burns, you look for larger wood, about 1 foot long. After you find just the right amount of wood, you place the larger pieces, one by one, on top of the fire. You listen, for a while. Slow popping, cracking sounds. You've created a hot wind. Pieces from the ground rise into the sky, swirling like water you've made in the air, connecting sky and sea. When a large piece of wood begins to smoke, move the stones. Leave a path of wood stacked lightly on each other to allow air and flames, but securely enough so the fire gathers strength. Once the larger pieces begin to smolder, you can be sure the fire will spread. Be sure you have left nothing and leave. When you get home, remember to wash your hands, your face, maybe change your clothes. Listen for sirens. I closed the book. Rain had begun falling, and I knew that today fire would not be possible. Fire would not be possible for hours after rain. I had learned this much, that the ground had to be dry as shadow if the fire was to travel and amount to anything. The bus came just as large splatters began glooming against the dry pavement. I found a seat in the back, away from the driver, away from the other passengers who sat reading newspapers or dozing while saliva iced their chins. I had a window seat, and I knew once I looked out at the moving world beyond that the windows of my bedroom would never again be enough. These windows, moving as they did, offered the perfect membrane for me to watch people, to watch motion, without having to touch any of it, without having to participate in any of it. With the soot, pedestrians and houses With the soot, Pedestrians and houses took on the surrealist look of one of those foreign films that my mother and I went to on nights when my father worked late. I had complained to my mother that I did not understand these movies, that the scenes moved forward, disconnected from one another, painting incongruous items like trains and potatoes. She told me I understood more than I realized, that I should just sit back and let the story speak. After a while, I learned to do this, and my mother had been right. The films transported me. The bus stopped at just the right speed to seem like a film, and through the haze of soot, the world tumbled by like those scenes in Paris or Warsaw, appearing edgeless and mutable, a place made of dream and water rather than anything of substance. If I closed my eyes, even slightly, the outside world moved from the simple distortion of the dirty window to modern art. Frame after frame of canvas sped by. A dot, a square, a fade of blue into silver, nothing real or solid, just impressions and whispers. I could do this without my usual fear of being outdoors. After all, I was connected to a tidy world of schedules and stops, driven by a person who knew routines and directions. I felt safe and untroubled, unable to be reached the way I often felt while reading or watching a movie. I knew I would take the bus again. The next morning in school, I told Julia about my new discovery, hoping one afternoon she would take the bus with me. She was looking at me the way a fish looks up through a tank. "What's wrong?" I asked her. We can go for free. Our bus passes are valid until 6 o'clock. "Listen, Maggie, I have terrible news." Her face rumpled before she continued. "Do you remember that boy we met in the park a couple of weeks ago?" I did. I had been envious of Julia's ease with the boy, of her breezy style. I had stood there gracelessly, solid and mute as a land barge, unable to speak. I could not figure out how Julia could continue to think of things to say, as I knew her mind moved more slowly than mine did. "He came over to my house last night, and my mother caught me with—" Julia looked around quickly. "If I tell you, are you going to hate me?" "I hope not," I answered. "Listen, Maggie, I don't know why I did this, but we started, kissing. I let him take my shirt off, and my mother walked in and found us." "Take your shirt off? Then what happened?" "Stones fell between us, large black stones with a mineral sheen, stones that had traveled soundless through space. They fell one after another from the school ceiling. The floor filled with them. Everything. Tomorrow is my last day in public school. She's switching me to Our Lady Queen of Peace." Something inside me collapsed. I could not imagine school without Julia. Not one day of it. "Maggie, it's not like we can't still do things. It'll just have to be on the weekends, now is all." I put my hand on Julia's shoulder. We stood there until the bell rang and the hall monitor came to us, hollering, "Ladies, that was the late bell. Are you deaf? Move along." I walked through the stones to first period math, my mind filling with gas. First my mother gone, now Julia. My only connection to the standard gone. My only connection to the drift gone. I saw myself entering a new world, diving into the deep sea with only a mask and no compass or chart. My assignment to draw a map of water. Only I would not be given equipment. For the rest of the day I sat inside invisible gas, inside a drifting substance lighter than smoke. I copied from the board. I went to my locker. I took the bus home without any kind of without any kind of mooring to my surroundings. I walked inside my house to find Hannah mopping the kitchen floor. She would never be reading a glossy magazine or baking a cake. Hannah would be mopping the kitchen floor, scrubbing out a toilet, soaking out a stain in the sink. "Hello, Magdalene," she said, without looking up from the lop-mop rhythm of her mopping. "Nice to see you." No one, with the exception of my father's half-sister Hannah Lepter, called me by my birth name. Everyone else called me Magda or Maggie. Hannah came to clean and cook on Friday afternoons, with a palpable sense of duty evident in her every movement, as though my father and I were natives of a remote island nation she had been sent to vaccinate. "I thought you would be here tomorrow," I said. "I'm doing a novena tomorrow," she said with surprise. "I'm doing a novena tomorrow," she said with surprise, as though I should be up on her prayer schedule. "I won't have time." Oh, I could not imagine Hannah ever being busy, ever. I resisted any agreement to the idea that Hannah suffered from overwork. That suggestion had begun long ago when my mother first began leaving. "You will have to help Hannah more, Magda, especially now," your father had said. "You were looking over the edge of Staten Island Ferry while your mother sat on a bench alone in the glassed-in section. Wind sliced through your coat. You were looking at the agate blue water, at the color your mother said looked like pulverized jewels. Winter water, your mother had commented, is never the same color as summer water. Summer water is clearer. Now things are different, and you will have to help me more, Magda," your father's voice said. But you were still trying to see if your mother's belief in the watercolor difference was right or not. Your father's voice was an interruption of your thoughts. "Magda," he went on, "you will have to help Aunt Hannah more. Do you understand?" "Yes," you had said, "I will help more." You were holding your mother's hand in the elevator inside the sand-colored building in Manhattan, and you pretended not to know what he meant. You wanted the trip to Manhattan to end. You wanted your mother's parched stare to end. Looking down at your mother's wrists on the elevator, and thinking how white they were, lambent as patches of snow or moon, and those tiny rivers of blue pulsing through them. A man came into the waiting room to take your mother inside. Then she disappeared until after the New Year. She came back and spent entire days staring at dust, and you knew the hospital had turned her into a fossil. She sat on the sofa, the light gone from her eyes, her face dark and featureless as shadowed stone. She had already begun her leaving. "I made a stew," Hannah had said. I wanted to say, "Of course you made a stew. You only make stews, or casseroles involving canned fish and peas. None of your food is happy or light. It is food born of duty and obligation, food meant for utility. Never would you think of making a pie, or adding slices of fruit to a dish. Never would you purchase a tin of cookies. Never would you indulge in spices. Even though my father gave her money to purchase groceries, she was prudent in her use of money, and she did not purchase good cuts of meat. She had never, not once, splurged or surprised us in any way. She did not even use salt in her cooking, and the result was food that tasted like steam. But Hannah did not know how to make anything connected to happiness as my mother had. My father told me I should have sympathy for her, that she only wanted to help, but I saw her help as veiled contempt, a phrase one of my teachers used to describe manifest destiny. Hannah had learned to cook in the convent, where a great sorrow, or a great disgrace, I could never be sure which, or if they were the same, since everyone simply referred to Hannah's time, in a hushed, sorrowful tone, had doomed her back to secular life, and eventually to my father and me. Whatever had happened, her life was now so spare and bleak that looking directly into Hannah's eyes depleted you. When I complained to my father about her being inside the house so often, he told me, There, Magda. Hannah's your aunt. We have to welcome family. She helps us now. She has always helped us. You can't expect to do all the work in the house, and Hannah loves doing it for us. She loves the fact that she can help. Then why do you pay her?" My father looked stricken when I asked this, as though I had just hurled thorns at him. "I pay her because I value her services." Then he had turned away, done with my complaint. Even that day I looked at the pale blue envelope on the counter, holding Hannah's check. You look like you've seen the Holy Ghost," Hannah observed. "Are you feeling all right?" "Yes, thank you," I said. "You better lie down." "Maybe I better," I agreed, feigning sleep, with a pillow hiding my eyes. I watched Julie through the gas, her small breast exposed and tender-looking, her nipples large as bulbs while the hands of the boy from the park reached over them, his fingers in the shape of lobster claws. "I brought you this," Julie said, the next day, the last few minutes of school. She held a small box out to me. "I wanted you to wear it, always. Inside was a twist of gold on a chain. I hope you like it. The shape wasn't definite, and I thought you would like that, Maggie." "See," she said, lifting the chain from the box and allowing the charm to dangle. "It's either a harp or a bird." "I remember how much your mother liked harp music. We always listened to harp music at your house. Remember my mother was so amazed? She said she didn't think anyone still played the harp." Julia clasped the chain around my neck. "Whenever I hear the harp, I will think of you and your mother, of all those times we went swimming at the beach, at the bottom of your street." I touched the chain around my neck. Students walked past, pausing to watch as we stood together. "And I'll remember how much you like birds," I said, my voice slipping. I was hoping you would think that. Would you wear it?" I held Julia's hand to my neck for a moment. I listened to the stones fall. I wanted to believe I would still see her, that the boy Julia's mother hoped to take her away from. I wanted to believe I would still see her, that it was the boy Julia's mother hoped to take her away from, but I knew Julia's mother suspected me of setting the last fire. I had ridden my bike over to Julia's house moments before the fire trucks arrived. "Why do you smell like smoke?" her mother had asked, and not nicely, while I waited for Julia to come outside and see the fire trucks. "Is it your hair that smells smoky?" "I must have been standing too close to the fire," I answered, regretting that I had showered but not taken the time to wash my hair. "This fire is a big one." Yes, it is," she murmured, her eyes falling on me like the eyes of God on Judgment Day. She knew. I could see that in her slow assessment, and because she knew, I feared I would not be seeing as much of Julia. Her mother's eyes had burned into my back as Julia and I rode our bikes over to the woods to watch the firemen. That fire had been 2 weeks ago, before Julia had met the boy her mother had discovered in her room. Now Julia was leaving. We let go of the embrace. I held the gold chain with the harp or bird on it while watching Julia get into her mother's car. A bunch of us stood waving at the window. I turned away from the sunny window, knowing that afternoon I would go into the woods. The ground would be dry as salt. I had set several fires before, the first few small and unimaginative, some spiky flames that sputtered out before they went anywhere. The fourth time I learned how to make the fire travel, how to lead it away from the source, to gain strength. One fire truck had come for that one. As I had watched the truck flash down our street, I knew one truck would never again be enough. 3 fire trucks had come for my last fire, as the brush in the woods had unexpectedly ignited. That is how I approached this fire, the one I wanted to show Julia, though I had no plans to tell her I would be setting the fire. I only wanted her to witness the excitement. I had not set a fire since the big one, as my father, a fire dispatcher, had told me the police were going to keep an eye on the woods. That was enough to scare me, and there was the new problem of Julia's mother. I still walked the woods surrounding our house, prospecting spots for possible fires, but I did nothing. I imagined eyes watching me from between branches, neighbors coming to their windows the minute I set foot in the woods, Julia's mother stepping out from behind the ferny silence of the trees with a snapping camera. But I would find a way around all that. This fire would be in honor of Julia. It had to be perfect. I smiled, knowing I would set it this afternoon on the last day of her attendance at our school. After watching the windows all day, I knew the day had been a warm and gusty one. On the bus ride home, I saw lines full of washing. That was always a good sign. I checked the inside of the house to make sure Hannah was off doing her Navinia. She was. The house was so much darker inside than the bright day that for a few moments I could not make out the tables and chairs. My eyes were full of greenish light, as though I had just dived beneath the surface of water and lost the sun as navigation. No sound rang from anywhere in the house, and for a moment I stood, weightless as a swimmer, unable to move in the unfamiliar atmosphere. Then I saw the porcelain teapot where Hannah kept matches to rekindle the stove's pilot light. Everything came back to me as I dipped my hand inside the teapot. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I walked roundabout into the woods, my seemingly loopy route tightening in concentric ovals while I kept watching. Seeing no one, hearing no one, my heart began to pound. The woods were mine, these dry woods with a strong wind blowing from the bay. I fingered the matches in my pants pocket, feeling the nearly full pack push out of the fabric of my jeans. No matter how much wind welled up from the bay, each match was one more chance. On days when I had fire tasks, I moved with a certain swiftness, browsing the area for future fire sites or inspecting branches for dryness dispelled my usual fears that I would drown in the infiniteness of the outside. My senses opened. I heard light whisper. I tasted the yeast of rain. Muscles over the exterior of my ribs in my flank region tightened as I walked. I thought of nothing else while tending my fires, nothing except the flame and the crackling pop and snaps of my fire. Fire, like silence, had a language I could not speak, but I could translate. I listened to the pops and snaps growing louder as they grew closer together, and the voice of the fire warned me when to leave. I walked rapidly through the woods past the field where old cars were dumped and spotted a clearing inside a sky of trees. About 20 yards from where I stood, an old mattress had been dumped in the middle of the clearing. The stained atrocity sprawled there like the carcass of an animal, and when I looked at the mattress, at its improbable appearance in the middle of these woods, where rabbits scampered and squirrels chittered, at these woods so close to people's homes, anger rose inside my brain. I could imagine the purpose of the mattress, dragged there by boys I probably knew, and I wanted it gone, destroyed, and I wanted to be the one to do it. The mattress had to center the fire, so I rapidly gathered sticks and leaves, only ones from the top of the piles, as the rest were still wet. I had become something of an expert at expecting the properties of kindling. I blanketed kindling on the mattress until its fabric could no longer be detected. The mattress blended in with the surrounding woods, a rise in a bank of full sticks and dry leaves. For a moment I was tempted to leave it and walk away, but as I turned to a nearby stump to consider this idea, a hollow log caught my eye. It proved light enough to be dragged over, a prized conduit for spreading flames. Never had I been so lucky. I wondered briefly if my mother had intervened with such luck, but I quickly pushed thoughts of my mother out of my mind while I worked. She had no business here. Artfully, I used the log as a bridge between the mattress and the dry field bordering the woods. I stood back admiring my work for several minutes, admiring the artistry of the pile, the varying shapes and colors of the connected heap. Then I struck the match. Obediently, the leaves and twigs on the mattress leapt up with a soft, ripping sound, a quiet, contented sound, as if they had been waiting there all day to be destroyed. I sat on the stump watching the flames swallow progressively larger and larger sticks, growing closer and closer to the log. Flames shot up from the sticks, and I could see them clearly, yellow at the same time, in the way that urine is clear and yellow at the same time. I could not understand, watching the flames grow to a fire, why our English teacher insisted that water was a symbol for the soul. For damp British souls, maybe, I had written in a note to Julia, who had nodded. She never wrote notes, and I saw now how she would do well with nuns and a focus on cursive writing instead of thinking. Watching fire always cleared my thinking. Fire should be the symbol for the soul, I thought, watching the fire move with no definite pattern or prediction shaped by the wind. That was a soul, right there, in front of me. These were the kinds of thoughts I could share with my mother, and I missed her now with a longing that made me shudder. I did not want to convulse like that in the middle of this warm spring day, with the heat of the blaze on my face, yet I did. A large crack sound splintered the air. The log had caught, and I could see how the wind, which had increased its force as the afternoon grew later, would tunnel the flames through the interior of the log and into the field brush. It was time to leave. I took one last appraisal of my fire, and satisfied, I ran through the woods. The woods wheeled by in patches of green and brown. By the time I sat down inside the mossy-colored silence of my house, I heard sirens and long yanks of horns. I heard neighbors out on the street calling their children inside. I changed my clothes, I showered. Then I sauntered outside as the disturbance had interrupted my afternoon of reading. "What's going on?" I said to Mrs. Langley, our next-door neighbor. She was leaning over her car watching the commotion. She turned to face me as she did. Two of her chins followed. "Oh, geez, these teenagers again. This is what? The third time in a month they did this." "Did what?" "I hate even telling you," Mrs. Langley sighed. "You've been so emotional and all." "You mean the fire? When they catch these kids, there'll be trouble." Mrs. Langley swung her head back and forth. "There'll be trouble, all right. The cops have been down here every day. Your dad is lucky you're such a good kid. The way you stay in the house, do so good in school, and stay away from the trouble." I murmured as I was scanning the crowd to see if Julia and her mother were there. I saw no sign of them. People ran everywhere, talking, pointing to the gray clouds of smoke rising from the woods. I stood in the street by Mrs. Langley, removed from the crowd, thinking, I have brought this neighborhood together. I have created this storm in the sky, this scent of ash that rides over us. I have changed the day. Shuffled around the calmness of the afternoon, opening the houses, the people inside them. I have made a window. I remembered the fire, the great splintering sound as the log ate the flames, and I saw what I had done as happy, creating a leaping force full of light and warmth that lit the darkness that spread inside all the houses around us. I brought light to a place where there had been only darkness in the exact manner of a redeemer. And that is done for chapter 1. That was a long chapter. I didn't realize it was going to be that long. Thanks for listening. Let me know if you enjoy it. Bye.
My movie. Stop. Record. Stop.